The MPA Capstone Project Presentation Slides. During the Capstone seminar, you will develop the Capstone project in stages. This week, your executive summary and presentation slides are due. This media lecture explains the presentation slides project. The presentation slide assignment. Your capstone project has three elements. There is the primary memorandum, the executive summary, and the presentation slides. Your project must include up to 12 presentation slides. The purpose of the slides is to reinforce an oral presentation of your project. You do not actually give the presentation either to your capstone class or to an audience. However, your executive summary is assumed to be an approximate version of the speech that you would give. So, the purpose of your slides is to reinforce an oral presentation of your executive summary. Let's consider how you might organize your presentation. Your project must include up to 12 presentation slides. Remember that your primary memorandum has 7 sections. So, why not consider having one slide for each of the 7 sections? Then you need to decide which sections get a second or even a third slide. Then you should decide what each slide has to cover. Remember, the slide does not have to contain all the words that you would speak. The purpose of the slide is to illustrate and reinforce your oral presentation. What might you include in your slides? A slide might include any of these: a bulleted list of major talking points, a diagram that illustrates your talking points, an image that illustrates a problem. Avoid including more than 30 to 40 words in a slide, and avoid using a font size smaller than 24 points. This is because your audience would not be able to read it. Let's examine how you can lose points in your slide presentation. Let's consider some examples of what you shouldn't do in a slide presentation. Imagine that you're in the audience for a presentation, and these are the slides that you see. Here is an introductory slide for a capstone project from several years ago. Note that the slide refers to the capstone project, names the professor. The capstone project is supposed to be a presentation to a real client and a real audience. And so you shouldn't include references to the class or references to your professor or anything like that in your presentation. Note also that the graphic that's used in this slide is distorted and grainy. That doesn't improve the appearance quality of the presentation, so avoid distorted and grainy slides. Now here is a very simple appearing slide, and in some respects it's very neat. However, in this case the entire presentation had a black background with white font. Consider whether that as an entire approach is sufficiently attractive. It might be for a very serious and important topic, but it's maybe a little hard to read. This presentation produced the starting slide as a copy of the memorandum which was submitted to the official. It wouldn't really make sense to have a slide presentation in a talk that included for the audience a copy of the salutation from a memorandum. So don't start your presentation off as a memorandum. Well, this slide has an obvious problem. We need to be careful not to have our graphics get in the way of our message. In this case, the graphics literally got in the way of the message. Now, in this instance, what the student has basically done is to cut and paste the student's executive summary into the slide. And that's really not a very effective presentation, in part because the result is that a very small font has to be used. The audience wouldn't be able to read or benefit from this particular slide. Also note that the slide is all capital letters, and to some people having a slide with all capital letters feels like shouting, and it makes an audience uncomfortable. So don't use all caps in your presentation. Once again, here's another example of a student who cuts and pastes the content of the summary into the presentation slide. It would not be possible for the audience to read this because the font size would be too small. And so this is not an appropriate way to summarize the literature review. The student should be more selective about the points that are to be reinforced in the slide presentation. Now here's a case where the student copied the policy alternatives matrix into a slide. The text in this would be completely unreadable to an audience, and so the analysis would be ineffective in terms of reinforcing the message of the presentation to the audience. So be careful not to have unreadably small text in your presentation. In this case, the student has a slide with a graphic, but the graphic has no meaning unless the audience can read the words, and the words are in such a small font that it would be impossible to read the slides. So this is a graphic which is unintelligible to the audience in the presentation. So try to have, if you're going to have graphics, have them be legible to the audience hearing the presentation. Here we have a graphic with unreadably small text that is combined with a meaningless title. What would it mean to the audience to be told that this is data? What is the message that the presentation is intended to convey? And does the use of the title data help to convey the message? So this is a slide in which we have the problem of the unreadable text in a graphic, but we also have a meaningless title. In this case, the student finished the presentation with a bibliography. First of all, the bibliography would probably not be legible to the audience of the presentation, but it really isn't necessary for you to include a list of bibliographical references at the end of your presentation. An audience would not be expecting this, and it wouldn't reinforce the message that you're trying to get across. So, what should you do? The following are some examples of what you might do. The advice at the beginning of the presentation concerned the organization of your presentation. Start with one slide for each of the 7 sections. Decide which sections get a second slide. Decide what each slide has to cover. Remember the slide doesn't contain all the words you would speak. And remember that the purpose of the slide is to illustrate and reinforce your presentation. Select a presentation style, a style for your slides that is clean and simple, and then stick with it. Focus on the big picture points that you're trying to make. In this case, the student decided to devote a slide to the question. And that's a good way to explain to the audience what the presentation is going to be about, because after all, the policy analysis was designed to answer the question. Arrange your content to reinforce your points. Here's a slide that lists an option and presents the advantages and disadvantages of the option side by side in the slide in a simple and readable way. Sometimes a simple graphic can reinforce what an option is about. In this case, the option concerned having cell phones have to remain in the student's locker at school, but the locker option then was reinforced by the image of the student in the locker, and so it was an effective choice of an illustration. Tables can reinforce your recommendation if they are presented clearly and simply. This is a table which presents the results of the assessment of options for a study of what cell phone policy might be in the New York City school system. So the student cut back and only selected some of the assessment dimensions, simplified the presentation of the findings, and then used bold font to identify the particular option which in her analysis was considered the most favorable. So this is an illustration of an effective way to use a table in the presentation to reinforce a point. Remember to end the presentation with a summary of your recommendation. This presentation ended with a list of the benefits of the recommended option in the student's policy analysis, and this was a great way to end the slide presentation. In summary, remember that the purpose of your slides is to reinforce an oral presentation. Therefore, you need to select your content carefully. A word to the wise is that less content is generally more effective. Less is more. Thank you.